Hi, and welcome to our class. Today is an asynchronous day, so I'm just going to take you through a few slides that will complement the reading we have for this week in the Play, Imagination, and Leisure class for Continuing Ed Liberal Studies. And last week you guys watched and wrote about hoop dreams, and you read a little bit about it, and those essays are starting to come in. Today's actually Tuesday, the previous week, and I'm recording this, but I'm going to upload it for you because some of you I know like to do your work in advance. So I'm just going to take you through these slides. This week we're talking about gender, sports, sex verification, and Title IX. And let me just give you a quick definition of gender. This is a society's often unequal differentiation between the categories of men and women. And what that's meant by is that gender is often seen as a binary sex category, or at least it's purported to be, whereby there's a binary of people who fit into a category of men or boys and girls and women. Obviously, with gender nonconforming people and the advent of different ways of interpreting gender, we're starting to question this binary. And a binary is two mutually exclusive categories. So what ends up happening with respect to gender is that there's a presumed relationship of sex differences that are seen as obvious with the gendered presentation of self. So we presume that people who present as boys or men have certain genitalia, have certain hormones, have certain chromosomes, and we presume that women who present as girls or women are the same. But biology is a category that is not as clear-cut as that, number one. Number two, it's also biology is an interpretation of the body that isn't necessarily as rigid as we are taught to believe. So gender is understood to be based on anatomy. The social practices of sex and gender and bodies actually reinforce what we believe to be under our clothes or inside our bodies. So gender is a constant negotiation. It's a constant performance of falling in line with culturally prescribed ideas of what it is to be normatively male or normatively female, normatively men, normatively women. So I want to just kind of put out there for you is that gender is often seen as a sociological or social variable that's deeply connected to biology, whereas biology is seen as a given, as a sort of rigid category. And even that is up for grabs, that actually biology is not as rigid as we would have believed, and that we impose a binary also on biology. For the purposes of our class today, we're kind of looking at things from a feminist perspective and from an intersectional perspective that looks at the mutual and simultaneous production of gender as it's interlaid with race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, and other areas of difference. So ability, age, religion, gender presentation, so that we have an intersectional way of understanding that in sports, gender is also racialized. Gender is also related to country of origin, right? How do people present with respect to gender? So think of like Russian female weightlifters, right? There's this notion that their gender sort of presents differently because it's coded as Russian or weightlifter. So we have to think about things with respect to geography and nationality when we talk about gender, because it's not a static category. And the intersection of all these things shapes things like our health, our wellness, our well-being, our morbidity, our mortality. Also, with respect to the global map of inequality, those who get to participate in sports and leisure have something to do with gender, in that it's not an equal playing field, in that not everybody can come to the table as having the right health status to participate in sports and leisure, and also imagination with respect to our classes. So that's just a quick sort of blow through of how do we define gender, how do we define intersectionality, coming at it from a feminist perspective. The things that you're going to have to review today bring into relief the idea of what it is to have your gender verified, what it is to have your gender called into question through sports. I think you're listening to a podcast too maybe this week. I might be wrong about that, so don't quote me on it. But you have materials this week that are beginning to have us question. And you're also going to look at, you're looking at a large data set, a large analysis of gender in sports that's been taken over a 17-year period. So sports maintains this gender binary And I would love to be in class with you today because we could talk about how that is, and we can certainly revisit this next week when we reconvene together. What are the ways that sports, both amateur and professional, maintain this gender binary? Why is it that you can't play sports if you're a boy or a girl and you're little in these little league things on the other's team? I mean, it's interesting because as I was growing up, I played on a boys soccer team my whole life, even though there was a girls league, and it was more or less accepted. There were no boys that tried to play in the girls soccer league. That was never even considered where I grew up. I grew up in upstate New York. But that gender binary was sort of rigidly maintained. And then when I went through puberty, it was sort of more suspicious for me to play in the boys league. And I eventually had to capitulate and start to play in the girls league. But we maintain this rigid gender binary, and we say things like they can't, the sexes or the genders can't compete because it would be unfair. I'm wondering what you all would think would be the societal repercussions of separating men and women and boys and girls from one another in sports and recreation. I think it has potentially some negative consequences of doing that, in that I think in many ways perhaps the sports are taught and learned differently, and the idea of bodies and strength and collaboration and solidarity that you get from sports is not shared across sexes. I know, for instance, when I was in college, I played soccer for my college, and my coach said that watching men's and women's soccer was like watching two different sports. And he really much preferred coaching women's soccer because he felt there was more finesse and grace in watching and coaching women's soccer than men's soccer. And I just thought that was interesting, and that's something that we could consider in class. How are gender and sex policed in sport? Well, this is something you're asked to consider in this week's materials that you're looking at, in that for some reason it's really important culturally for us to decide and define definitively what is a man and what is a woman, and to come up with some kind of standards of determining that to create more equality in competition. I think this is really interesting because it shows a level of hysteria around keeping the categories of male and female very rigid. And that shows a kind of general anxiety about the fact that perhaps the categories are not as fail-safe and strong as we thought they were. The other thing that goes on in sports is the reassertion of hegemonic masculinity. We talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago, but I wanted to bring it to your attention again. Hegemonic masculinity is the belief that there is a hierarchical arrangement, so a triangle, if you think of it, where at the top there's the least amount of people with the most amount of power, and at the bottom are the most people with the least amount of power. And hierarchy is a way of organizing power, and it's stratified, so that in hegemonic masculinity there's a constantly changing, slightly always out of reach, perfect expression of masculinity that men are striving towards. And it is to assert the idea of what makes the man strong, what makes the man the winner, the victor. And this is interesting because just as men achieve whatever they think is the hegemonic male, there's another man, because of competition, nipping at their heels to be that hegemonic man. And so you're only as good as your last victory in hegemonic masculinity. And hegemonic masculinity is often linked to athletic achievement, the idea of being picked last for a sport, and that being the rite of passage of degradation and humiliation for many men, or not being good at sports, or not understanding sports statistics, right? That there's something about the performance of being a legitimate man and having a relationship to sports. And I want to just put out there that sports is a sort of training ground for boys and men to learn what it is we value about them, a stoicism, a competition, a sort of expertise about something, brute strength, these types of things. The thing that's interesting is we seem to, with respect to gender roles around femininity, not value that for women. Although women and girls do want to participate in sports, so much so that we had this federal ruling called Title IX, which is a federal civil rights law that's part of the Education Amendment of 1972 that protects people from discrimination based on sex. So you can read this, at your own leisure, but this is what Title IX basically says. And what we want to point out is that it has through Title IX, women and girls got to participate much more in athletics and sports than they ever had before, because colleges and high schools that received federal funding had to bring in alignment how much money and resources they were dedicating to male and boy sports, also equally to women and girls sports. This obviously hasn't led to professional sport leagues. I mean, I guess the WNBA and some soccer leagues that women and girls can go into for professional sports, but most professional athletes for women, for most team sports, stops after college. Not all, there are some. And things like golf and tennis, women certainly can and do dominate in those sports. But Title IX attempted to try and rectify what was seen as an unequal distribution. And as we've seen in the class, some see sports as an opportunity towards social mobility, not just to the dream, like in Hoop Dreams, of becoming a super athlete, but in the kind of creation of a community of making connections to people through sport relationships, right? A sort of kind of, we were on the same team, and this leads to a kind of camaraderie, which produces economic opportunity later. And that by denying girls and women the opportunity to create this kind of bonding, to have this kind of community, to learn certain skills, I mean, one thing we know for sure is participation in a sport often is a very good protector against, for instance, eating disorders or disordered eating. To deny women access to those things puts them in harm's way around other traditional tropes of femininity. So Title IX was to try and redistribute. It was a redistributive policy. But what also ends up happening is that through the advent of increasing women's participation in sports, we also construct a notion of defining what it is to be a woman and a man again. So we kind of come for full circle back to this, where with respect to sex, we impose this idea that there exists a sex binary, as I talked about at the beginning, where we have genitalia, chromosomes, hormones, and that these are stable things that we can measure to say what is actually a man or a woman. But actually, these things vary across time. There are different rates of hormones. There are different shapes of genitalia. There's also, not everybody's XX or XY. Sometimes there's double XY. There's a lot of variation in what sex is. And historically, what we've done is we've done surgery or given treatment to babies' bodies that don't neatly fit in the dichotomy. That's in intersex is a diagnosis that we actually give babies, and we try and change the baby's body to fit into the gender binary, rather than sort of saying maybe the gender or the sex binary is incorrect. However, what we have is we have people who don't necessarily fit neatly into the categories of sex, but for their lives grow up behaving and acting as men and women when their bodies don't neatly fit into one of these binary categories. And because we don't test all people to see, we don't actually know how prevalent it is. One article suggests that 1 in 100 people are intersex. There's some reason to think that that might be an underestimation, but still, that's still a significant number of the population that doesn't neatly fit into the gender binary. But they go out and they live their lives pretty much put into one of the categories to survive. For instance, because sex is a unique identifier that's put on all our identity documents, it would be very hard to live in the world without having to identify in one of the sexes. Yes, people are starting to do that by changing things, but the birth certificate, the license, these documents, these identity documents are very hard to change. So we have the case of Dudi Chand, who is an athlete who's participating as a woman, competing as a woman, started winning as a woman, and brought in criticism from others saying that perhaps she was too masculine, perhaps she wasn't a woman. She and other famous athletes, which you can go on to read about, have produced the need for something called the sex gender verification to determine someone's eligibility to participate in a single-sex sporting event. And these criteria of what gets to pass as a man or a woman are not static either. These change over time. So we see a sort of what we would call ontological, meaning the study of being, an ontological chaos about what actually gets to count as a man or a woman. And some of this really resonates within the sporting community as competition becomes greater, as people move farther and farther up into approaching professional and high-level amateur sports. And it's interesting because, right, we would think that, as we've talked about in this class, like sports, play, leisure, fun, imagination wouldn't have would be a way of getting outside of race, class, gender as a place of enchantment and moving away from some of these political issues. But in actuality, it becomes another staging ground where we play out some of the very real ideas about social mobility, institutional racism, sex verification, and the policing of gender and sex are happening in these very locations that we've designed for our leisure. Excuse me. So part of what I want us to kind of understand is that this has very real consequences on people's lives. As Sean has said, the high androgen level produced in my body is natural. I've not doped or cheated. If I follow the IAAF guidelines you have attached, I will have to undergo medical intervention in order to reduce my natural produced androgen levels. I feel perfectly healthy and I have no health complaints. So I do not want to undergo these procedures. I understand that these are interventions most likely decrease my performance levels because of the serious side effects and because they will interfere with the way my body has worked my whole life. So she was basically told she had to go on these medications in order to lower stuff that her body was doing naturally. So it's sort of like the steroid crisis, but mandated steroid intervention on a body that doesn't neatly fit into a category, and therefore sort of making her the example of medicating people to come back in line, sort of like the intersex example, back in line with what's a normatively gendered body. Okay, so that is the lecture I have for you today. I'm grateful that I get to see you next week. I've missed you, and I hope that you find the assignment something you can do. You have to go to, you see what you have to do. You have to go to this document and kind of answer a series of questions. Hopefully my lecture helps to make sense of some of the terms that you need to use. And yeah, and I look forward to seeing you guys, and I hope you're having a great week. Okay.